Thank you to everyone that's joining us today, whether you're online or whether you're viewing this on YouTube after. And a big thanks to our panelists for joining us and for sharing their thoughts. This is the fifth talk in the Design History Now series. And kind of what happened was, as we listened to the previous speakers, we began to notice that many of the previous talks have touched upon institutional knowledge or very specific institutions. Sometimes it was the sort of challenges inherent in these spaces, as well as individuals' experiences of them. And our introduction to the speakers as well, and sometimes the speakers themselves, has till date generally placed them in the context of institutions almost by default, with kind of biographies or biographical notes that focused on the speaker's sort of institutional affiliation or background. And not because this sort of bears upon the work that they were presenting necessarily, although I think it probably does, but because this is sort of simply how we often define and legitimize knowledge. In our own introduction to the series, we spoke about the need to kind of move away from design histories that too narrowly focus on institutions and on individuals and kind of singular canons of design. And yet almost every talk, and some of our talks to come, do touch upon or will touch upon some kind of an institutional role, if not an institution specifically. And almost all our speakers are the products of often seemingly hallowed institutions. So we wanted to just kind of take a pause today and to talk specifically about the institution and unpack its significance in the context of design history. And whilst we'll kind of predominantly talk about design institutions, because they are, after all, largely still the sites of the production of design history knowledge, we hope that this conversation is going to challenge these institutions and consider alternatives and parallels across other spaces as well. The work of the four panelists joining us today has interacted in various ways with the idea of institutional knowledge. And we're going to hear from each of our panelists in just a second. I'd like you to hear them contextualize their own work in their own words. But if you would still like a kind of conventional biographical note, we're going to drop these into the chat so you can find them there. So without further ado, and by way of introduction, we'd like to ask each of our panelists to situate themselves in relation to the institution and to offer a brief reflection of how that experience has shaped your current understanding of institutions. And we'll begin with Tanveer. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Nia, for that lovely introduction, and massive thanks to all the organisers for today and for the kind invitation today. I'm super excited to be here with all the other panellists. So my name's Tanveer Ahmed. I'm based in the UK and I teach in London and was born, have most of my training's been in London, and my role is at Central St Martin's College, which is part of University of the Arts London, and I teach fashion design. So my research has always been about fashion, and it's really been based on, my research has been based on experiences of teaching fashion for a long time. So I started teaching fashion maybe over 20 years ago, and I fell very much into the kind of dominant norms and the Western canon in the UK. I was told, right, we need you to teach 20th century history of fashion based around French fashions, UK fashion, American fashion, and Italian fashion. And as soon as I began really teaching that and building my curricula, lots of my thoughts began to unravel and critique what is the canon that I'm doing and how am I reproducing Eurocentric thinking. My current role is quite unusual. The Central St Martin's has appointed several people to bring about research, the that kind of challenges the Eurocentric canon through decolonization and through anti-racist thinking into their departments. I'm appointed in the fashion department as somebody that brings in anti-racist thinking. The sort of things I might do if a colleague, for example, is working on a project about denim, for example, I would be challenging the dominant norm that denim is an American fashion fabric and kind of bringing ideas from much more wider global thinking and challenging this idea that it's always knowledge based around the West that we teach students. So hopefully I'll get the chance to talk a bit more about that today.
Thank you. Saurabh, would you like to go next? Sorry, I have changed my order. I just realized. I will come back around. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So thanks, Nia and BIC. Hello everyone, I'm Saurabh Tewari and I'm based in Delhi at the Indian Institute of Technology Department of Design, which is fairly new, you can say 5 years old. And my training has been as as an architect, then a communication designer, and then into design history. And I have been teaching basic design to architecture students, then design students, and now to the bachelor's of design students also. I mean, who just come after their plus 12 system, and also how kind of I situate myself here is that a designer and a wannabe design historian, because I don't have a formal training in design or history, though my doctoral work was about design history, but not necessarily. I'm primarily a designer who's attempting to write history. So that's one thing. And also an academic who's kind of pushing in the value of design history in the Indian curriculum. So I teach communication design and also history of design, and largely trying to kind of expand the knowledge basis from South Asia, and through a very, very bottom-up approaches, through developing case studies, through developing new ideas from the ground. And I also believe in the idea of decolonization. However, I personally think that decolonization need to be without xenophobia. So I'm kind of, I'm okay with the coexistence of the old and the new thought, and let the students or the learners or the new audience decide what is best for them. My idea is to kind of push in all the possible cases available and put on their table, and then let the learners or the students decide what is best for them. If they ask for my advice, yes, I'll give my advice for sure. Thanks, Nia. That's it.
Thank you. Over to you, Belle.
Thank you, Nia. Jai Bhim, everybody. I do not have an institutional affiliation at this point in my life. I'm still in between thinking if I should get back into an academic institution or no. But to give you a little brief background, I did my first master's in communication design from DG Academy in Coimbatore. Back then, Singnapalli Balram was our dean. And then I did my second master's in design research from the Bauhaus recently. And I strongly believe that as creative producers, as creative practitioners, it's very important for us to be outside of institutions. And so I use Instagram primarily as a medium to sort of challenge the Brahminical roots of Indian design and the way Indian design history has been written so far. I find this to be a slightly easier medium, not just to pen down my thoughts, but also have more people engaging with whatever is currently being written in design journals, which obviously is not easily accessible to everyone. So my point of view is that if I'm a designer, if I'm a practicing designer, and if I have certain thoughts, based on my lived experiences or the experiences of people from DBAV communities. It only makes sense that I speak about these on platforms or in spaces where I know that this information or this dialogue or these thoughts would be accessible to them outside of Brahminical institutions that form the very core of Indian design and Indian design institutions. Yeah.
Thank you all. And I'll give just a quick kind of context to myself as well. I studied a bachelor's in graphic design, and after about 10 years of practicing, I decided for a number of reasons that I wanted to study the history of design history. And I did that in a course run in the UK, in London, between the Royal College of Art and the V&A Museums. So this is kind of, between a museum and an art school. It's one of the oldest and few design history programs in the UK, and it's rooted in these two spaces. But for me, it was kind of the museum context that was sort of overwhelmingly the strongest influence on this experience. It kind of seemed impossible for me to avoid the context of a colonial museum literally sort of all around me at the time. And my interactions with art students within the RCA in the art school did tend to sort of compound this feeling. And when my work was kind of discussed within the art school, it didn't quite feel critical enough, and I suspect it probably wasn't, and that was kind of interesting to reflect on afterwards. But as most of my work concerns design here at home in India, I felt this kind of growing discomfort with the ways in which knowledge of design from or about South Asia was kind of understood and owned within certain UK institutions. And despite sort of much really kind of important and really critical work on decolonization, I felt at times that India still remained this kind of distant place in some of these conversations, and often I kind of didn't feel that it was being sort of this challenge of where India and South Asia sort of sits within these conversations wasn't really being kind of ripped apart in really satisfying and helpful ways. And I'm hoping we'll sort of be able to get into that, perhaps a little bit, some of the nuances of that in our conversation as well. But it certainly often felt that conversations around South Asian design, design from India, were still for European and North American audience. So I think this question of kind of who design history is for, what design history is for, has sort of come to define my relationship to design history. And I'm a little nervous, I think, at times that certain institutions or certain spaces are becoming the kind of gatekeepers of design history, knowledge, and narratives. But I'm also gently hopeful as well. I think that there's a growing body of design history work in India happening outside formal institutions, and I'm eager to see where that sort of takes us, and the kind of critical voices that those sorts of spaces provide a platform for. And a shout out actually here to the platform Future Us, which is where I first came across Bao's work and Tanveer's work as well, and is a great sort of platform for new and critical thinking. And here in India, I'm part of a growing network of design historians. And I'm sort of excited to see where that takes us to. And again, I think we might touch upon what those sort of spaces look like as we get into a conversation. So I want to begin by considering sites of knowledge, or rather sites of knowledge production. I'm interested in who you think the arbiters of design history knowledge in India are currently and in the UK, and do you think these spaces are inclusive or exclusive? Is there more nuance to the question? I have a feeling that the actually how black and white this question might be will depend on your experience of institutions. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts. And I'd like to put this particular question actually to all the speakers, but let's start with Bao, if that's okay.
So I would like to start this discussion with this Nigerian author's quote. I think his name was Chinua Achebe, which when he said that lions need to have their own historians, and until that happens, history is always going to glorify the hunter. I have yet to come across any design institution in India where any mention of design history even slightly acknowledges the contribution of Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, Vimukta communities in the making of these institutions, or even in defining what design is, or design history, or design knowledge. And so I think that for the longest time, and even now, elite ableist savarnas have always been the ones to dictate what design history is for us. I can't say about other South Asian countries, but at least in India, that has been the case, where every time I have even slightly just randomly Googled design history, I will get the founding story of NID. I will get the story of the LOTA. I will get the story of the India Report and Charles Henry Ames, and all of that. But there's not a single mention of caste, and it's very convenient for all of these institutions to never center caste around design, because at the end of the day, if you look at India, if you look at how the institutions, the education, the society functions in India, it's entirely based on caste. And anything and everything to do with education has always been governed by upper caste, Brahmins specifically. And so I think that till the time that narrative is pulled down by Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, Vimukta designers, we're only going to have that one specific narrative of Indian design history. And that then makes me question, like you said, are these spaces inclusive? I honestly don't think they are, because recently when I filed for multiple RTIs across all of the NIDs, across IDC as well, as to how many faculties, researchers, or even students for that matter, from I think 2010 to 2020, are from SC, ST, OBC categories. There was no response from any of these institutions whatsoever. So it kind of reflects, that they that these institutions continue to sort of silence and erase and conveniently appropriate knowledges that Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, Vimukta communities have been producing for centuries now.
Thank you, Val. I'll put that to you, Tanveer, as well, and then maybe we can kind of come back to picking up on some of these ideas.
Thanks, Val. That's such important points that you're making. From a UK perspective, in parallel to your discussion about the racism around the caste system, we have the racism around the diaspora. Like me, I'm second generation Indian, born in London. My parents emigrated from India to London in the 1950s. So the one of the key issue, I think, for me is this relationship between representation, who is actually creating the knowledge, and how the knowledge then gets made. Because lots of the time the discussion can be quite limited by saying that we just need representation. So, for example, the institution I work in is saying that we need to have 30% of our staff who are non-white, and that somehow that will that will change knowledge production. But the fact is, it doesn't necessarily do that. It helps, and it's an incredibly important factor, but it doesn't necessarily mean the knowledge production can change. You can still have very capitalist, racist, sexist forms of knowledge that are still being taught as design history, essentially. So I think then there's also the question that was mentioned earlier about much more bottom up methods of how we teach and think about design history. So my doctoral research was around trying to reclaim Indian fashions and global South fashion. So what I did, rather than to resist racist tropes about Indian fashion, I taught students by using my mother's clothing. So my mum she never assimilated into Western clothing, and she continued to always wear a sari and dress in her regional form of draping. So to teach students that they should adopt that approach for every culture they're researching, for every form of design that they're looking into, I brought in bags of my mum's clothing to teach them these different epistemologies and to help them recognize that there are many ways of understanding what is design, and that ordinary vernacular forms of clothing are just as important as something that's been designed and put in a museum, and to open up the histories of everyday people. And in the UK context, the immigrant as being just as important as, in my context of fashion, just as important as Chanel, for example. The sorts of things I'm doing now are, for example, we don't have the books in the libraries. We can construct our reading list, but the books don't actually even exist about certain design histories. So I've been trying to look into other stories of fashion and those fashion histories. So trying to find, as crude as it sounds, trying to find old immigrants who might be able to use oral histories to tell students about design histories that haven't been written about. So I wanted to find out about the Caribbean contribution to fashion in the UK. So I searched in my networks for the oldest person we could find, who was in his 70s, who then came and spoke to students. So I think that we have to look for these different pedagogical methods, these different sources and resources to create different alternative forms of knowledge that challenge the dominant canons that we have, because we can see very clearly that they are very universal and, you know, just tell one story. And as your quote so beautifully put it, you know, we need to find all those other histories from the marginalized, oppressed communities and bring them to the fore.
Thank you. Over to you, Saurabh, and then I have some follow-ups.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, there are many sides of production. I mean, I can imagine the media, the culture, the design studios and their practice. But primarily, I'll situate myself in the design institution because I'm part of it. And I've gone through this institutional process also, not just in my location, but also as my subject interest. So my PhD, like my doctoral work, looked into the idea of design in the design institutions in India. One of the things which I realized that, you know, mostly design in India is the design with a capital D. It means the discourse which is very, very Eurocentric. And the whole idea, the whole argument which I was making throughout my work is that, you know, there's a discourse beyond the Eurocentric popular ideas, like Bao mentioned about the Charles and Reims, or NID's own selfies or autobiographies, which is also very, very, like, you know, which has lenses of power. So if you look at majorly the histories, it's a history written by the people from NID. And when you see a consolidated one, it's a history which is based on the directors, so on the tenure. So it is very, very, very absolutely kind of top down. And within the whole discourse, there are many histories which are kind of ignored within the institutions also. The history from the students' perspective, the history from the other participants, like, which I'm unfortunately calling as others, like, the people who are helping the students in a design lab to shape their, let's say, some creative models, the lab assistants, how they have seen this whole idea of design shaping up in India in the last 70 years. So this is one particular point. Second is often in India, I mean, if you look at National Institute of Design, even its Hindi translation is Rashtriya Design Sansthan. It is not Rashtriya Abhikalp Sansthan. Design is a discourse which is largely Eurocentric, whereas Abhikalp represents the idea of creativity. NID has chosen its Hindi name to be as Rashtriya Design Sansthan, and many other departments or the design schools also have chosen the same, because primarily what they are talking about is a design with a capital D, and now in the same domain, very, very formalized discourse of UI UX, especially in the last 10 years. I mean, if you go to Twitter or internet, design is all about one particular form, mostly the digital form of it. There have been opportunities to change it, but there are challenges on the ground, and which includes several challenges, whether it's ontological challenge, like what is design, and then epistemological challenge, who defines design, and then also methodological challenge, how to do about it. So these are the challenges on ground, but still there is an opportunity. So while we are talking about Eurocentricity and a discourse from which is totally marginalized, and within marginalized, what Bao also talked about, the DB discourse, Dalit Bahujan Adivasi discourse, I would like to give one of my reflections. So in 2019, we had this one particular studio on design studies, and I thought that we'll go to Northeast, some place. So we chose Apathani Valley in the northeastern region, which is one of the exciting tribal site. And we thought, okay, we'll go there and we'll try to see what we can tell the people on site. We went there to only realize that we know nothing. We know nothing absolutely, how people live. So we thought that we'll tell them about design, and realize that how useless are we, especially when we talk about this new age ideas or the needed ideas like sustainability and resilience. We learned so much just by being there, just by talking there. And unfortunately, all these discourse are not there in the academia. So one of the things which I have been doing personally is to kind of increase the discourse, especially from the tribal heritage or the tribal life in India, which I think has a great potential to contribute to the design academia. And then second layer would be design history. So layer by layer, we are kind of approaching. As of now, the site of this design history appears to be very, very exclusive, but at least through my privilege, I acknowledge my privilege. I think the academics or the writers who have the access to language or the media have this great responsibility and also an opportunity to kind of expand it to make it more inclusive.
Thank you. Thanks all for starting us off. I think to begin with, I'd like to come back to a point that Bao raised. I'm just interested if you can kind of expand a little bit for us on what you spoke about in terms of appropriation within institutional knowledge and design knowledge. Could you sort of say a little bit more about where you've seen that and what that looks like to you?
So I remember we had this course. It was a part of one module on liberal arts, and there was a Brahmin man who was called in, and he taught us how to, or what is the Vedic science behind construction of temples and the statues that are used in, South Indian temples, the proportions of all of these things. The other very obvious observation is, if anyone has read the India report, it quotes the Bhagavad Gita. And you'll find many such instances like this where Brahmanism is sort of at the core of whatever is considered as knowledge in any design institute. Historically speaking, the Brahmin, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas were not the castes that engaged in creative production at all. It was the Shudras and the Ati Shudras who engaged in creative production, whether it is pottery, whether it is leather works, or whether it is carpentry, or whether it is even the making of the lota. There is a specific caste which makes metal lotas. So when such institutions talk about design knowledge, these are knowledges. They are not homogeneous, because the DBAV community is extremely vibrant and extremely heterogeneous. Like, for example, a Dalit community in Konkan is not the same as a Dalit community, say, in somewhere in a village near Trivandrum, or somewhere in UP, for example. But at the end of the day, Brahmanism, the caste system, sort of forces the Chambar, Chamar caste to engage in that same specific, occupation, generation after generation. So when institutions, design institutions, sort of encourage design students to explore material, these are students who are primarily coming in from upper caste, upper class, elite households, who know what leather feels like in terms of an accessory or shoes or watch. They know brands, where to purchase it. They know, like, what kind of finish they want for these particular, leathers and all of that. They enter these design institutions with absolutely no knowledge of where that leather is coming from and how that leather was made by a Chamar person in the depths of Dharavi, right? So design, when institutions say, yeah, design knowledge, we are providing students with this knowledge to prototype, to test, to create all of these things. These knowledges don't belong to historically don't belong to upper caste people, because a Brahmin has never ever held hide of an animal in his hand and then labored for days on end, consumed all of those chemicals, and decided to sort of convert it into leather. And then on top of that, he also doesn't have the knowledge that the leather from a cow versus the leather from a horse or any other animal is very different, and different kind of hide is used to make different kinds of things. We use leather to even make the strings of the tabla, or even mridangams, for that matter. It's not the same kind of leather that you use. And these knowledges, nobody discusses any of these in design institutions. These are things that we learn from our ancestors, because our ancestors were forced to be in these occupations. People from our community are still forced to engage in these occupations. So this kind of knowledge, whatever is convenient from this knowledge, is taken in design institutions, where students are like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna quickly sketch out this shoe or this purse or this wallet, and I'm going to use leather for making this. And then the faculty is like, okay, great, these designs look great, why don't you make a prototype? And now when you have to make the prototype, the second year student does a first year student doesn't know how to make that product, where to get that leather from, how to treat leather, how to stitch that leather, what kind of an awl is needed or needle is needed, what kind of threads are needed, how do you use a lighter or a candle to sort of, melt that thread and, stitch it up there, things like that. What kind of zip would be needed for any of these things? The student doesn't know. And so the student has, because of caste privilege, has access to go out into places like Dharavi or go access, a cobbler on the street anywhere in India and, be like, just tell the cobbler or tell the person that, this is the design that I have made. This is what I want to do. Make this for me, or, show me how to do it. So the design is made, the prototype is made, everything is done. The student comes back, presents it during the jury, and there is no acknowledgement of caste, A, and B, there is no credit given to the Chamar caste or the Kumbhar caste or that person who for free gave his ancestral knowledge to this person in order for that design student to become, an accessory designer or a pottery person or whatever. Like there's zero acknowledgement of that. So this kind of appropriation that happens, the knowledge stealth that happens in design institutions, I find it very funny because on the one hand, academia just I apologize for my language, but academia is very anal about plagiarism and crediting and all of these things. But it's very convenient and it's very okay to steal and appropriate all of this and get away with it. So I'm yet to come across any designer from an upper class elite positionality to sort of acknowledge that when they were in a design school, these were the prototypes that they made, and this is the person that they went to, and this is the person's name, and that they are grateful to this person for sharing that knowledge free of cost. Because sadly, that person barely earns 5,000, 6,000 rupees in a month in their little cobbler shop or inside of Dharavi slums. Whereas the design student has, paid lakhs and lakhs of fees, graduated, has started their own, design studio, or is working for a very big brand or a big company. So I find this knowledge appropriation, the stealth, like quite sort of disturbing to speak.
I think this sort of divide that you're getting at is really important and perhaps not spoken about anywhere near enough between design education and production and understanding who makes what you design and their relationship. And I think for me, there's a sort of way in there for perhaps a historical lens to actually step back from a very sort of contemporary history of design institutions to sort of a history of production. I think there's also a lot in there about ways in which currently students are the kind of curriculum that students are being asked to work within. So I think fairly briefly, because I want to get onto some more sort of questions, but I would like, because I think we've had a really mixed audience for these conversations, and I would like to just very briefly sketch out what that curriculum actually generally looks like on a design course. So perhaps Saurabh, you could start, and then Tanveer, you could sort of reflect on what that looks like in the UK.
Right. So primarily it is very, very Eurocentric, and the idea of modernity, and then comes the design. And especially in design also, we see more of designers' biography, author monographs, and extending further. If I'm adding bio can relate to it, perhaps. One of the things I would like to borrow from architecture history. So in architecture history, they talk a lot about Le Corbusier, and because of this iconic city that they have designed, Chandigarh. However, nobody talks about the people who gave land for the city. Nobody talks about the masons or the laborers who actually made the buildings, who actually kind of made the city. At max, there would be Corbusier or some of the senior officials or architects within the city, and of course the then prime minister. So it is very, very kind of top heavy kind of narrative that we have, and this is also very prevalent in all the design histories that we have. Often the focus is on the person, and if I have to, I will blame it on the pioneer approach, Nicholas Persner's pioneer approach, which came to kind of the art and the architecture, and then also design that, which kind of glorifies the individuals, and often this individuals are elites, or from the Brahminical core, or from from only the privileged caste or the privileged class for that matter. So this has been the discourse, but majorly it is the Eurocentric discourse that we have in India, being taught in design history, and also some of the things from the art history, but nothing from our ground, and this has been an issue. And this has also been an issue because in many design schools we do not acknowledge even craft as design, or any other form which is very, very bottom up, which is from the people. We will dismiss it as as a jugaad, or as an informal design. So even the idea of design is also very, very kind of modern and very, very sanitized, very, very industrial design kind of form. So this has to be very, very top down. So that's it. I mean, that's a harsh truth. And then in my personal capacity, I'm trying to kind of expand it, not necessarily by revolting against it, but kind of presenting an alternative so that people see and judge, like I said, themselves. That's it.
Shall I go, Nia?
Yeah, please, if you can give us just a sense of how that compares to the UK curriculums as well.
Sure. So I think there's quite a big divide between design history and the design practice. I think that's important to highlight. And from what I see, I think design history departments are recognizing the need to address the kind of what you'd call the kind of patriarchal approach to design history that's very top down, sexist, racist, and so forth, and it gives a very linear idea of what design history is. And so I'm part of other people teaching design history in the UK who are calling for these changes. It's a really hard task, but I think the things that Bao's talking about, the inequality in society, there's the need to recognise how that plays out in every discipline. So every discipline is going through this discussion about who gets to tell what stories and which stories are being missed out and which stories reproduce sexism, racism, heteropatriarchy, and so forth. And so I think that for me, an anti-racist approach in these situations starts from the basis that it's a biased, sexist, racist history. Okay, so, I go in there knowing that that's what the dominant norm is. So how am I going to undo that? How do we unpick that? And unpicking it is really the task that we need to do. And more the students are doing it. So in the UK, we're finding when students aren't happy, and I'm sure it's the same, I know it's the same globally, when students aren't happy with the education they're receiving, they are being active about it. They are the ones who are raising issues about the reading list. They are the ones who are saying, no, that's not true, and putting their hand up in lectures and so forth, because many of them are involved in lots of activism around addressing inequalities in society. So the task really is to think about how do we build a much more inclusive design history in this case, and recognizing the inequalities, the injustices that we have in our day-to-day living. It's no surprise that they're reproduced here and they're pushed here. And I think around labour and production is a key issue. One of the things that I do, for example, in design history is, rather than teach about the history of the superstar celebrity designers or the very recent always histories of only 19th and 20th century, I teach about the history of the sewing machine. And it's a really interesting one that opens up discourses around labour and production, and particularly the violent histories that are associated with the sewing machine. For example, the enslavement of Black people in America and the way the sewing machine was used to create garments to further that project.
I'm really I'm grateful that you've given this example as well, because I think sometimes these conversations just sort of remain at this level of where the problems are and kind of unpicking that, but actually some really concrete examples of how you're working within the system right now is interesting. And I'd like to kind of put the same question to Bao in terms of for the moment, thinking about an institutional framework, sticking within the institutional framework, and then I'd like to sort of get to alternatives. But at the moment, if we sort of are still looking at design schools, is there anything concrete or any change that you could see that can be made now that you feel would kind of fill in some of what is missing?
I think lots of change, and we can start with first understanding how we look at things. We are not taught in design schools how to look at things, because each one of us comes from a certain positionality, and when we are 18 or when we're entering our masters, 23, 24, we have seen the world function in a certain way. We know of the world in a certain way. And when we enter design institutions, I think way before we are taught what color theory is, or how to sketch, or how to, I don't know, criticize design, or what is good design, or what are logos, and any of that. I think what would make a world of a difference is if you're taught how to acknowledge A, our positionalities, and B, to learn to see things not in the way we usually see them. So when there's an upper caste elite, Brahmin boy or girl, or any student who comes in from this background, enters an academic space or design school, for example, and they have seen the world in a certain way. They understand gender, they understand religion in a certain way. What they don't understand is how, say, a Muslim student understands design or sees design, or Muslim students or a Christian student's interaction with design or visual language, how that would be, or how a Dalit or an Adivasi student's perceptions of perceptions of seeing things would be. This upper caste Brahmin student doesn't know that. This Brahmin Hindu student would definitely not know that. And I think if design institutions can make space for more Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, Vimukta students, and then sort of acknowledge that there are multiple knowledges that exist within the design studio, and sort of be welcoming to all of these different design knowledges. I think that would create like just it'll be a start somewhere, because when we think of geometric forms, when we think of calligraphy, when we think of art lettering, everybody rushes to Devanagari. Everybody rushes to Gurmukhi or Bengali. But the Arabic script has had such a massive contribution in the field of calligraphy. It or even for that matter, the motifs around mosques, the motifs around the beautiful Qurans that they design. None of this is considered or even forget talked about. Like, there's no mention of any of these things which significantly contribute to India's visual design or India's design, like education. There's no mention of any of these things. How churches are so beautiful in Kerala or in Goa or anywhere for that matter, in say Tamil Nadu, for example. There's no mention of the motifs that are there or the paintings that are there. There was recently on Twitter, there was a very beautiful painting of Jesus. It was a mural from one of the South Indian churches. It was painted so beautifully. I'm yet to come across any visual designer, for that matter, who would even acknowledge this as good design or good visual design. But everybody wants to sort of monetize after like 20 years on the 90s kids were like this, or the early 2000s were like this, the packaging was like this, so Phantom cigarettes or Polo or Britannia biscuits and stuff like that, and you want to monetize on that and be like, oh yeah, this packaging was like this, it solved the purpose, it didn't really abide by the rules of graphic design, but now we're going to make like a very fancy exhibition out of it and make money out of it. But nobody acknowledges all of those DTP operators who are actually busy printing all of that in the packaging industry or any of these things. So I think that within the design studio space in an institution, first and foremost is knowing what one's positionality is, and acknowledging everyone else's positionality would make like a massive difference in how we see knowledge, how we exchange knowledge, and how we sort of catch ourselves on in time to prevent appropriation.
Would anybody like to pick up from that? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, I partially agree and I partially disagree with Bao, because I think personally, like, in the last 10 years, things have been changing, at least kind of expanding in terms of acknowledging the positionalities and also including different forms and various forms of knowledge which were not necessarily talked about. So I totally agree that in past things have not been talked about from the marginalized community or the large other, but only kind of controlled by only a few privileged or the elite. I mean, there is absolutely no disagreement with that. But dismissing it that nothing is happening beyond, for example, in the typeface design, like beyond Bengali or Gujarati and all, I do not agree, because I myself have like a lot of friends in the communication design who come from like tribal background, and they have been kind of elaborating right from like securing the Unicode for the types and for the letters, and then also kind of digitizing it and also looking into several scriptures which were not necessarily in the written form. So things have been happening, at least in the last decade, at least in my experience. About, I mean, like I mean, here I would like to kind of disagree respectfully. Second part is like, it is, I personally think that, just by kind of replacing some curriculum is not going to solve it, because then it's going to become like, a conflict within the academia or within the idea of design history, whose history it is. I think the presenting the different forms and like, putting it on them, including acknowledging the personality, right from all the actors, and not just believing that it's only one person who designs thinking beyond that, thinking design in the systems, including the social systems, and also especially in the tribal world, you would see that, these are socio-ecological systems, that how nature is also kind of associated with the idea of social. So these are just my additions here. I mean, wow, thank you.
So I want to make sure that we do have enough time for our audience questions, and we can kind of come back to some of my questions as well. But quickly before that, I wanted to touch upon the idea of accreditation, and the idea that the conclusion of the time spent in an institution, a design institution or particular design institutions, is often some sort of accreditation, a diploma, a degree, perhaps a certificate. And I personally have never been asked if I graduated, if I have a degree. And I think that might reflect possibly on where I studied and the kind of trust that comes with saying that. And I think possibly reflects on the usefulness of certain accreditations in this space. But I'm interested to hear from you, Tanveer, whether you see challenges in creating accredited people through institutions, and maybe we can also skip to if there's some alternatives to that you can imagine.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and there's a lot of movement around discussing social justice oriented forms of assessment, because as you were saying, Saurabh, about, you can change the curricula, you can bring in more different types of educators, you can play around with different forms of informal assessment, but ultimately that hierarchy of an educator and a student is embedded in our institutions. And that kind of goes to the heart of the project of social justice and inclusive forms of history. How do we do this kind of work in institutions which, have a front door which only allow you in if you can afford things, if you have certain ways of speaking, if you come from particular, as you were saying, about the particular caste or class, and there are so many barriers to even getting in to study. As we know, we're already in the very privileged space of talking and educating people about design history. One of the things that I found really useful has been to use non-formal spaces in the institution as a way of thinking about these issues. So while I taught at the Royal College of Art, where you studied near, I co-facilitated with students a space for Black and women of colour who were non-binary to come along and to kind of really self-educate and think about the issues that they wanted to talk about. So I think that in terms of accreditation, that was a space where it wasn't anything to do with formal assessment. It had no value whatsoever in terms of your curriculum vitae and all these sorts of things. However, it did create a different space of knowledge production, which was really important for myself and the students, where we broke down those hierarchies. So I think the institution can be reshaped and reconceived, but there will always be that hierarchy of who gets to come in, which is where things like where we're talking today are really important, these kind of open source places. I'll pass to you, Sarah.
I would like to add here on the panel, in my previous institution and also the current institutions, I was, not just me actually, but my colleagues, we were convinced, and we were able to convince the authorities also, because, you know, if you look at the honorarium rates for the guest lecturers in a typical Indian institutions, they're based on the number of experience, but also the degree. So it assumed that someone who has a doctorate will be paid more than someone who has a bachelor's or just an undergraduate degree. I mean, this is there's a kind of in the name of objectivity. And we had a problem in the department of design, because we had to, when we are calling a typographer who is a master's or maybe a PhD, and then we also want to call a person who do a lot of street painting, who's actually a practitioner, a real practitioner of typography in our culture, who is shaping literally our visual environment, or as Bao said, a DTP operator. So we convinced our authority that, we are treating them as experts, and we are going to pay them as we pay the others. It took a lot of time to convince, but at least in design, and especially in the communication design, we were able to convince that, whatever we are going to kind of hear from these experts who have not just their own knowledge, but generations of knowledge. And also, I do not know much in detail, but there's an institute in Jaipur who kind of came up with this idea that they had this artist in residency. I don't know what is happening now, but in one of the vision notes, I saw that they employed craftspersons as faculty members with equal pay and with equal facilities, with equal opportunities. So I think some of us have been able to kind of argue it out in our space, and also expand the understanding of design to the larger decision makers. Nia, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. It was bound to happen eventually. We have about 30 minutes, and I'd really like to open this up to our audience. I have still lots of questions, but we can always come back to me later. What I'm going to do is just pull up the chat, and I believe that we have a couple of questions that have come in. Great. So I think we'll start. If anybody would like to read out their questions, they can also let us know, maybe as you write your question as well. But I will begin with this one that's just come over to me, and I'm just gonna read it out for you. And if you would like to take it on, then perhaps you can jump straight in. And the question says, if we were to project Ajanta Subramanian's work on the Indian Institute of Technologies onto the field of design, I reckon the, in quotations, woke Savannah designer will now begin to handle materials like leather and theorize and intellectualize the craft to a point where they begin to take over the labor traditionally handled by those lesser privileged. It is not difficult to assume that leatherwork might eventually become the foray of the accredited Savannah designer, just like Brahmins now preside over technical mechanical engineering. Once the province of non-Brahmin labor class, So now, how do we prevent this with more liberal, inclusive education in a way that we do educate designers about labor, but disallow them, or rather teach them, not to usurp a craft that, quote unquote, belongs to someone else? It's quite small types. We're really getting close there. Would anybody like to sort of address that to begin with? Yes, Tanveer, thank you.
Oh, it's Bao speaking.
No, I can't find the question.
Oh, Nia, you're on mute again.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start putting myself on mute. I think this came as a direct question. Sorry, I'm just getting used to the chat.
I'll say quickly, I mean, I can talk a little bit about the issue of cultural appropriation, which is of a very big issue in Western design educational institutions. And so one of the things I think we need to think about is the approach. So it's so much, the examples that's been discussed here, you know, we could all think about maybe another 500 examples, but it's about the power imbalance. It's about, you know, it's about colonialism and how design is rooted in colonial techniques, about one group taken from the other. So it's really about teaching, I think, all of us to really recognize when that's happening. And it's a very much, I think, a collective endeavor. At the moment, design is the problem with our institutions is that we teach design generally as an individual endeavor. Students do their project, they go off on their own. I think if we had much more collective ways of understanding and thinking through these problems, that would help, for example. But we need to teach students about the role of power and privilege in the design process and the historical. This is where design history is so important, to recognize all the ways that in our disciplines that design has been rooted in these colonial forms of making and doing, and excluding, for example, the person who makes it for, as you were saying, Bao, a few thousand rupees a month, and really centre their stories so the designer understands, and we rethink the whole design process entirely.
Any further comments on this question? I'm unable to send it over to you, but we will keep the questions for later, so we can always have a conversation on the YouTube chat as well. I'll move on to the next question. Just let me know if you'd like me to come back. This question is from Petra Sates. I'm curious about the panelists' thoughts on of the weighting of design history within design education. Is enough time given to design history to communicate both the canon of design history so that students can engage meaningfully with conversations within the discipline and all the nuance you are all communicating, you as panelists? In order to move towards a more holistic and fair design history, do we need to take over more time of design students' education? Does there need to be less studio time and more history time and more theory time?
Can I answer that? Yeah.
Absolutely, please.
Great. So thanks, Petra, for this question. Actually, I would like to tell you one personal story here. So when I was being interviewed for the faculty position at IIT Delhi, one of the panelists, one of the interviewers, I mean, he kind of literally asked me, why students need to study design history? They just have to do design. Why do they need to know? So for me, the question was ridiculous, but it was also very, very fundamental, that why do we need to know design history or history of design rather. Finally, I was admitted and I'm here as a faculty member. And I realized that, within the semesters or within the courses available, there's always a huge tension that, whether to teach design more or the design history, or to take people or the learners on the ground to learn from the culture. One thing through my own work and through my own practice, I try to kind of practice or preach design history as a way of knowing. So I realized that it's kind of infinite. If we kind of cover up modern history or Japanese history or Turkish history or Indian history or different types of histories or martial history. But what more is important for a designer or to be a design historian is to understand the need. Why do we need to study design history? And also, how do we need to know design history? One of the things in design is that design is a way of knowing. So even to establish our basic conversations, we would like to know each other's background. We ask, where are you from? What's your cultural background? What's your educational background and all? So in design also, I personally think that when someone is designing, it's very, very important to get to know the history of that particular object if they are designing, or the type, or they are looking at the larger discourse, and then also some of the nuances and some of the things which have been left. So it's also very important that what not is covered, because there are opportunities to look and also kind of practice or preach or design what has not been covered. So I would suggest, and this is what I practice, design history as a way of knowing and as a way of practice. Of course, there are certain things which we can cover within the limited space available for design history in terms of courses.
I actually wanted to come back to the previous question, if
Yes.
that's okay.
Yes, please. Absolutely.
So I really doubt if, the woke Savarna elite is ever going to sort of engage in actually uh, going like all the way to convert hide into leather, because uh, as far as I remember, my own design institute and even NID, these are stories from like my friends who studied at NID, who actually are from DBAV communities, like all of us, and actually wanted to, do the process of converting hide into leather inside NID, uh, but were not allowed to do that. So it's a long, long way when, the woke Savarna elite designer is going to think that, okay, yeah, now I'm going to capitalize on, this labor. I'm going to be very, woke about the kind of words that I use, and even acknowledge that, oh yeah, whatever, this is from this caste, or this is uh, traditionally done by a certain specific community. Uh, what what would possibly happen is that uh, they would employ more people from uh, these marginalized castes and be like, okay, yeah, we're going to pay you like fair amount of money for this labor, and make a profit out of it, and also glamorize the fact that, yeah, you know what, we engage in social design for innovation kind of practices, and be like, yeah, we're giving them the opportunity to sort of uh, work and engage and you know promote it as a respectful job, which in reality it's not for our caste. And so I really don't see this happening, that someday there's going to be like a Brahmin uh, designer who's going to be like, okay, yeah, now what I'm going to do, I'm going to work in the slums of Dharavi and uh, convert hide into leather and whatever, document it and stuff like that. I really doubt that, because if that was the case, then I think by now we would have gotten rid of manual scavenging, we would have gotten rid of uh, the Kumbharwada itself inside Dharavi, we would have gotten rid of the entire leather sort of slum area inside of Dharavi, all of this would have happened by now. Like if Brahmins had decided to sort of, monetize on this or capitalize on this in some way for whatever benefits, this would have happened ages ago, and you and me would not be having this conversation here.
I think this possibly the sort of economics of this and possibly relates in a way to the next question. Swarnavali N asks, design often relies on patronage, which comes from the privileged. Design itself, one may argue, is not a need, quote unquote need. Design education is expensive. Thus, do our social structures favor design by the elite for the elite? If yes, does this pose a challenge to make design more inclusive at its very roots?
So if I may answer Swarnavali's question.
Absolutely, please.
Yeah, so Swarnavali, I mean, I totally agree with you that, it is very expensive. But I would like to look into the other side, which is the broader side, that whether it's inaccessible. Like the government institutions like IIT or subsidized, where the students are given a lot of scholarships and all. The problem also lies in the accessibility, because we take students through an entrance examination where you need to know a lot of things. So literally you need to be a designer to get into a design school. And then you need to be trained through certain, certain coachings or certain processes. And this is the unfortunate part of our larger higher education also, whether it's the IIT system where people come through JEE and all. Those who need it or those who really deserve it are often kind of left behind in the competition because of several accessibilities like training or some kind of coaching or some kind of knowledge or prerequisite things. So yes, it is expensive in the private institutions, but where in the government institution where it's kind of financially accessible or financially affordable, it is inaccessible due to the entrance procedures. So continuously, we are also kind of arguing within our community that how we can make it really inclusive. If we can have people from people from, let's say, from Adivasi community directly coming and joining our master's program or the bachelor's program, and then all. But then again, taking the burden of public institutions where objectivity, RTIs, all these processes, they matter. So nobody wants to take that route. That's the unfortunate part, Swarnavali.
Can I elaborate on this a little bit?
Please, yeah.
Like Saurabh rightly said, accessibility is like one of the key issues here. And so fundamentally, why accessibility or how accessibility becomes an issue is that if there is someone who has had heard of the word design at some point in their immediate environment, or has had some level of exposure to the fact that higher education in our country has a field of design where you can draw, you can animate, you can be an automobile designer or a transportation designer or a product designer, or even a fashion designer for that matter, or an interior designer for that matter. One has to have that kind of caste capital, economic capital to be in such a surrounding where this conversation actually happens, that people around you are discussing that, after 10th or after 12th, I'm going to take up science, or I'm going to take up commerce or something like that. I'm going to take up arts, and then I'm going to prepare for my entrance exam for these design institutions. Now this gap is what is primarily the issue, because if there is someone who comes from a really marginalized caste, to an extent, I would say that tribal communities do have sort of better access to these kinds of information, where they can go to different institutions. There's NIFT, there's IDC, there's NID, and all of that. But someone coming from say a Dalit or a Bahujan caste, a marginalized caste, which is very different from an Adivasi community, knowing that such forms of education exist, formal education exist, that itself is like a very big privilege. The second privilege, like the second thing that you also have to think about in terms of accessibility, is that when we think of going to an educational institution, we think in terms of being employable, being able to earn enough money to run our households. And most of us are first generation learners. And if most of us are first generation learners, art or design is not something that would be like the very first option that we would think of, because we want to climb up the socioeconomic ladder. And so looking at economically stronger options is always the preference, in comparison to thinking of, oh yeah, I'm going to spend 4 years in a design school, pay the fees. But even if the fees in institutions like NID or IDC is fairly affordable, there are scholarships available, and stuff like that. We also have to keep in mind that these institutions are very casteist in nature. So being able to handle that kind of environment, firstly, and secondly, design is not something where you buy a textbook or you buy a reference book and you have a bunch of notebooks and then you go to your class and you study. And that's not how design works, right? We all practice when we enter the design studio. So we need stationery, we need equipment, we need like a whole bunch of things to make stuff. We always make stuff, and all of this requires money. All of this requires a lot of sort of exposure, because somebody coming in from a tiny remote village in UP may not know what Staedtler pencils are. They may know only what Apsara Platinum Extra Dark Pencil is, Natraj pencil is, and they will draw with that. But then design institutions sort of expect you to have, at least in your foundation year, where they teach you sketching, rapid sketching and stuff like that, they expect you to have like the whole set of Staedtler pencils from HB to 8B. So so this is something that we really need to openly discuss in public, and not just in academic spaces, as to how do we make design education more accessible and affordable to Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, Vimukta communities.
I think you've spoken really eloquently to a practicing design student within the courses that we've been discussing. And then if we're to sort of talk about a research practice as an extension of that, I think that the difficulty is only compounded further. And what grants do exist often rely on a certain accreditation or a certain background from institutions. And I think it's kind of, there's a sort of cycle there of inaccessibility at times. We do have just 5 more minutes. There is, let me just have a look. There's a question that I think is quite challenging. I'm going to read it out, offer it to the panelists, and otherwise perhaps end on one last question. Ankit Singh says, economic historians of India are divided on essentializing colonialism. The issue of contention is locating the problem of inequality as external factor or internal historical experience. Where would you place the narrative of inequality from that debate on economic thought to design history? comparing design history with other paradigms or other paradigms through design history, which one is more beneficial?
Can I answer that? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ankit, for this wonderful question. Uh, like I can only relate to the work which I have done. Primarily, my work deals with post-colonial history and all. But when I was looking at pre-colonial or the colonial history uh, of design, of course, there was not much on the design with the capital D, but on all the possible other forms, whether Shantiniketan or like or the Crystal Palace or and so on. At the same time, there have been a lot of crafts historians like Professor Tirthankar Roy, who I think is also popularly known as economic historian from South Asia, practicing in London School of Economics. You would see range of descriptions, including the caste, because primarily he talks about craft. Whenever there's a discussion on colonial craft, caste is very, very intrinsic. And you would also see that, how the hierarchies of trade and the labor are also kind of detailed in a lot of these descriptions. So, I mean, whether internal or whether external, I mean, that I do not know. But I know that, especially the colonial history, if you see of design or the expanded design, including the idea of craft, would also include the idea of caste. Perhaps when we talk about design in the post-colonial terms, it is very, very modern idea, which is very, very coming from the West. And then all these issues, including the caste and the labor, were unfortunately kind of dissolved or evaporated from the narrative, because it came from a totally different understanding of making things, that is designed with a capital D. And rightly mentioned by Bao, even Charles and Ray Eames comes to India and then they talk about Bhagavad Gita, but not necessarily literally the craftsmen on the ground or the people who are sourcing the material or who are kind of making things for the designer or for the larger sahibs. So that's a bit unfortunate part, because especially in the post-colonial times, so in the post-independence time, I would say the craft discussion was lost in the discussion of design, and especially the Charles and Ray Eames paradigm, I would say.
Any final thoughts on this, Tanveer?
I would just say that I think by looking at what inequality is and how inequality manifests itself and how hierarchies are created is the root of why we've got different biases happening. So I think the task really is to understand exactly in our discipline and in design history how those hierarchies have been constructed, and then the job is to deconstruct those hierarchies. And that's a whole other panel, but that's the real task at hand, and it's really difficult. But I think that, as I said, from my perspective, thinking about an anti-racist and more of an activist perspective, you always start from the inequality, because we live on a globe that's built on inequality. And I think one thing when we're talking about economics is we haven't talked much about capitalism today. And I think that design is shaped always through capitalism, and the way we're thinking about it in our design schools is always about a capitalist structure, and we need to, as part of the job, to deconstruct those hierarchies. Where were the things that were made? Every human has a capacity for design and has always designed. How we make those, how we rethink the objects that were designed outside of these capitalist structures and really investigate them is really exciting. So I saw a whistle that was made in a museum last week that was 18,000 BCE, before Common Era, one of the earliest musical instruments, and it really does make you stand still and really think about what it is that we are choosing to teach in our design schools, and why we do focus so much on the last few centuries and we don't go back really as far as that.
Thank you all. I think that that's a great place to end this discussion, but hopefully open up future discussions into the rest of the series and pick up from where we are right now. It really just leaves it to me to really thank all of the speakers. I know that being involved in panels and doing talks, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of mental energy, and outside of already busy work days. So I really appreciate it. And we're really looking forward to having you back in our future talks in the audience, and to hear your voices again within that. So thank you very much. And thank you very much for everybody joining us. It's been a great discussion today, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Jai Bhim. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.